देना तो चलता रहता है, लाइफ में लेना देना तो चलता रहता है। इधर फ्लेक्सी लोन से बोरो कर लिया और उधर बाय मॉम डैड का वेकेशन डन। शादी का डिसीजन लिया, फ्लेक्सी लोन से और बोरो किया। प्रमोशन मिला तो ये लो थोड़ा लोन वापस कर दिया, थैंक यू। नए इंटीरियर्स का डील किया, फ्लेक्सी लोन से फिर थोड़ा ले लिया। ईयर एंड बोनस मिला तो इस बार लोन ज्यादा वापस कर दिया। लाइफ में लेना देना चलता रहेगा तो लोन्स में क्यों नहीं। इसीलिए फ्लेक्सी लोन फ्रॉम बजाज फिनसर्व एक ऐसा लोन जो जब चाहे बोरो करें, जैसे चाहे रीपे करें, वो भी चुटकी में। थिंक इट डन विद बजाज फिनसर्व।
हेलो, हर सीजन के लिए नए इंटीरियर्स।
हाँ, वो भी हर रूम के लिए।
फ्रिज, स्मार्टफोन या बड़ा टीवी,
तीनों क्यों नहीं?
अरे ये तो शॉपिंग लिस्ट में नहीं था।
सो अब शॉपिंग कार्ट में तो है। सॉरी।
अच्छा, नए आउटफिट्स की विश लिस्ट।
विश क्यों? Just add to cart and buy।
तो ये सब EMI पे,
और वो भी चुटकी में। On India's fastest growing EMI network. Think it done with Bajaj Finserv.
सर, अपनों को खुश रखना इससे आसान हो ही नहीं सकता। साहब, अपनों को खुश रखना इससे आसान हो ही नहीं सकता। हुजूर, अपनों को खुश रखना इससे आसान हो ही नहीं सकता।
अपनों को खुश रखना इससे आसान।
अपनों को खुशियां दिलाना आसान नहीं बनाते तो आगे कैसे बढ़ते। इसीलिए हम जो भी करते हैं उसे बेहतर बनाते आ रहे हैं, बनाते रहेंगे। बजाज फिनसर्व, थिंक इट डन।
माँ के बेडरूम का एसी या लेटेस्ट मोबाइल फॉर भाई, लेटेस्ट मोबाइल फॉर भाई, लेटेस्ट मोबाइल फॉर भाई। पुणे, पटना, चेन्नई, मथुरा या फिर बेगूसराय, या फिर बेगूसराय। नए घर के लिए चाहिए 4K टीवी हाई फाई, या फिर वाइफ को चाहिए लेटेस्ट स्टाइल। EMI है ना, EMI है ना, EMI। मॉड्यूलर किचन में पुराना फ्रिज क्यों है भाई?
शादी है नहीं, मैट्रेस पुराना है भाई। अक्खा इंडिया बोले भाई प्राइजेस है हाई, बेस्ट ही खरीदना है तो अपने EMI स्टोर पर आए।
EMI है ना, EMI।
अब काशी हो या वाशी, महंगा लगे तो EMI और बेस्ट ही चाहिए तो भी EMI, क्योंकि बजाज फिनसर्व का EMI है ना। विजिट www.emistore.com।
EMI है ना, EMI है ना, EMI।
नाची 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 नाची। धोखा है धोखा, धोखा ना खाओ जी। नाची 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 नाची। इंश्योरेंस फ्रॉड से बचना है बहुत जरूरी जी। नाची 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 नाची। वो एजेंट है या फ्रॉड पता लगाओ जी, एक्स्ट्रा ऑफर के झांसे में कहीं फंस ना जाओ जी।
अगर कोई अनजान कॉलर इंश्योरेंस पॉलिसी डिटेल्स मांगे तो कह देना उनको
मिलके स्कैम को एंड करो, हमेशा सेफ रहो जी।
Always verify the caller and do not surrender your insurance for attractive offers. हमेशा सावधान रहे, safe रहे. Issued in the interest of public awareness by Bajaj Finserv.
नाची 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 नाची। धोखा है धोखा, धोखा ना खाओ जी। नाची 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 नाची। जो होगा सो होगा ऐसे ना सोचो जी कॉल पे कोई पूछे OTP दो ना जी तो कह देना उनको मिलके स्कैम को एंड करो हमेशा सेफ रहो जी
Being a hero is all about heart. It's not about ruling the world. It's about owning it. It's not about winning a race. It's about delivering a smile to the human race. It's about a spirit that just cannot be confined by geographies. It's about the heart that beats for the future. And a soul that echoes the values of generations. And yet, being a hero is never about the hero. It's about the millions who celebrate them. Hero Motorcorp, the motorcycle leader. There's a gush of wind that hums a sweet song. There's a gush of wind that fights like a hero to fill the world with possibility. There's a gush of wind that jumps across oceans and mountains, embracing the entire planet. There's a gush of wind that blows away darkness. There's a gush of wind that blows for humanity. Because at Hero, we care.
In 1868, the Tata Group was founded on a philosophy that put the community at the heart of its existence. Today, we are $100 billion global enterprise. Our today has been built on enduring values. Today is about delivering excellence across business sectors. Is about building a future-ready nation. Our today has a strong foundation with community at its core. Our today is dedicated to the communities we serve. Our today is always about more than just today. Our today is a continuous journey for a better tomorrow. Tata, leadership with trust.
Behold, the story of victory, of life over malady. Behold the saga of power, of science over sickness. Behold the tale of triumph, of dedication over disease. Behold the rise and rise of Cadila Pharmaceuticals Limited, one of India's largest privately held pharmaceutical companies based out of Ahmedabad, Gujarat, India. Cadila Pharmaceuticals was born out of the vision of a legend who left an indelible mark in the chronicles of Indian pharmaceuticals industry. He was Indravadan Ambalal Modi, the founder chairman of the company, rightfully christened as the medicine man of India. His vision to alleviate pain of the underprivileged through research-driven innovations has been driving Cadila Pharmaceuticals for more than 6 decades now. Innovations which are backed by the key strengths of the company, the state-of-the-art manufacturing and research facilities. The flagship manufacturing facility at Dholka, Gujarat, sprawls over 100 acres. This avant-garde facility is US FDA approved, besides meeting most of the stringent quality standards across the globe. It manufactures tablets, capsules, injectables, liquids, and orals. The second formulations manufacturing facility is located at Samba in the state of Jammu and Kashmir. The API facilities at Ankleshwar, Gujarat, manufacture a large number of key APIs and intermediates at this US FDA and ISO 9002 and ISO 14001 accredited plant. The company also has set up its first ever overseas formulation manufacturing facility at Addis Ababa in Ethiopia. This world-class facility is the only WHO CGMP compliant manufacturing facility in the region. More than 850 products spread across 12 specialties with many of India's top brands in its basket. Great goals are defined by far-sighted vision and achieved by seamless teamwork. A multicultural, multilingual and multinational workforce of over 7,000 employees is truly the propelling power of the company. Not just in the domestic market, the company has a wide global footprint with over 1,000 marketing authorizations across 85 countries. Its international sales force of over 150 highly diversified and versatile personnel lends it an outreach that blankets the globe. As the company grows, so does its commitment to research. Manned by more than 350 scientists, the R&D facilities of Cadila Pharmaceuticals at Dholka, Gujarat is an institution of breakthrough innovations. To take the focus on innovation to the next level, it partners with leading international companies to discover newer treatments. The Cadila Pharmaceuticals Group is gigantic. Its group companies complement and expand the dynamic vision of the company across new avenues of healthcare and newer fast-paced business areas. Cadila Pharmaceuticals is a gentle giant. Decades of dedicated research, groundbreaking healthcare innovations, and worldwide impact proves the infinite potential of one powerful emotion. Care. The success of Cadila Pharmaceuticals bears testimony to the fact that the care continues.
आने वाले कल की दस्तक हमें सुनाई देती है, नई मंजिल है जिस ओर हमें वो दिशा दिखाई देती है। नए इंडिया का नया जोश, नए इंडिया का नया जोश, नए जोश से निकल पड़े हम, आने वाला कल होगा हमारा। नए इंडिया का नया जोश,
और नए इंडिया के सफर में टेक्नोलॉजी की शक्ति लेकर आपका भागीदार रहेगा रिलायंस। नए इंडिया का नया जोश।
लाइफ में लेना देना तो चलता रहता है। इधर फ्लेक्सी लोन से बोरो कर लिया और उधर बाय मॉम डैड का वेकेशन डन। शादी का डिसीजन लिया, फ्लेक्सी लोन से और बोरो किया। प्रमोशन मिला तो ये लो थोड़ा लोन वापस कर दिया, थैंक यू। नए इंटीरियर्स का दिल किया, फ्लेक्सी लोन से फिर थोड़ा ले लिया। ईयर एंड बोनस मिला तो इस बार लोन ज्यादा वापस कर दिया। लाइफ में लेना देना चलता रहेगा तो लोन्स में क्यों नहीं। इसीलिए फ्लेक्सी लोन फ्रॉम बजाज फिनसर्व एक ऐसा लोन जो जब चाहे बोरो करे, जैसे चाहे रीपे करे, वो भी चुटकी में। थिंक इट डन विद बजाज फिनसर्व।
हेलो, हर सीजन के लिए नए इंटीरियर्स?
हाँ, वो भी हर रूम के लिए।
फ्रिज, स्मार्टफोन या बड़ा टीवी?
तीनों क्यों नहीं?
अरे ये तो शॉपिंग लिस्ट में नहीं था।
सो अब शॉपिंग कार्ट में तो है। सॉरी।
अच्छा, नए आउटफिट्स की विश लिस्ट।
विश क्यों? जस्ट ऐड टू कार्ट एंड बाय।
तो ये सब EMI पे?
और वो भी चुटकी में। On India's fastest growing EMI network. Think it, done with Bajaj Finserv.
सर, अपनों को खुश रखना इससे आसान हो ही नहीं सकता। साहब, अपनों को खुश रखना इससे आसान हो ही नहीं सकता। हुजूर, अपनों को खुश रखना इससे आसान हो ही नहीं सकता।
अपनों को खुश रखना इससे आसान।
अपनों को खुशियां दिलाना आसान नहीं बनाते तो आगे कैसे बढ़ते। इसीलिए हम जो भी करते हैं उसे बेहतर बनाते आ रहे हैं, बनाते रहेंगे। बजाज फिनसर्व, थिंक इट डन।
माँ के बेडरूम का AC या लेटेस्ट मोबाइल फॉर भाई, लेटेस्ट मोबाइल फॉर भाई, लेटेस्ट मोबाइल फॉर भाई। पुणे, पटना, चेन्नई, मथुरा या फिर बेगूसराय,
या फिर बेगूसराय।
नए घर के लिए चाहिए 4K टीवी हाई फाई, या फिर वाइफ को चाहिए लेटेस्ट स्टाइल। EMI है ना, EMI है ना, EMI।
मॉड्यूलर किचन में पुराना फ्रिज क्यों है भाई?
शादी है नहीं, मैट्रेस पुराना है भाई। अक्खा इंडिया बोले भाई प्राइजेस है हाई, बेस्ट ही खरीदना है तो अपने EMI स्टोर पर आए।
EMI है ना, EMI।
अब काशी हो या वाशी, महंगा लगे तो EMI और बेस्ट ही चाहिए तो भी EMI, क्योंकि बजाज फिनसर्व का EMI है ना। विजिट www.emistore.com।
EMI है ना, EMI है ना, EMI।
नाची 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 नाची। धोखा है धोखा, धोखा ना खाओ जी। नाची 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 नाची। इंश्योरेंस फ्रॉड से बचना है बहुत जरूरी जी। नाची 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 नाची। वो एजेंट है या फ्रॉड पता लगाओ जी। एक्स्ट्रा ऑफर के झांसे में कहीं फंस ना जाओ जी।
अगर कोई अनजान कॉलर इंश्योरेंस पॉलिसी डिटेल्स मांगे तो कह देना उनको।
नाची 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 नाची। मिलके स्कैम को एंड करो, हमेशा सेफ रहो जी।
Always verify the caller and do not surrender your insurance for attractive offers. हमेशा सावधान रहे, safe रहे. Issued in the interest of public awareness by Bajaj Finserv.
नाची 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 नाची। धोखा है धोखा, धोखा ना खाओ जी। नाची 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 नाची। जो होगा सो होगा, ऐसे ना सोचो जी। नाची 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 नाची। कॉल पे कोई पूछे OTP दो ना जी,
तो कह देना उनको।
नाची 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 नाची। मिलके स्कैम को एंड करो, हमेशा सेफ रहो जी।
Being a hero is all about heart. It's not about ruling the world. It's about owning it. It's not about winning a race. It's about delivering a smile to the human race. It's about a spirit that just cannot be confined by geographies. It's about the heart that beats for the future and a soul that echoes the values of generations. And yet, being a hero is never about the hero. It's about the millions who celebrate them. protocol, the motorcycle leader. There's a gush of wind that hums a sweet song. There's a gush of wind that fights like a hero to fill the world with possibility. There's a gush of wind that jumps across oceans and mountains, embracing the entire planet. There's a gush of wind that blows away darkness. There's a gush of wind that blows for humanity. Because at Hero, we care.
In 1868, the Tata Group was founded on a philosophy that put the community at the heart of its existence. Today, we are $100 billion global enterprise. Our today has been built on enduring values. Today is about delivering excellence across business sectors. Is about building a future-ready nation. Our today has a strong foundation with community at its core. Our today is dedicated to the communities we serve. Today is always about more than just today. Our today is a continuous journey for a better tomorrow. Tata, leadership with trust.
Behold, the story of victory, of life over malady. Behold the saga of power.
Get all these messages.
Exactly. The world collapses if you don't push the button. That's right.
We are live now, Dr. Forbes.
Okay, very good. So we'll go ahead and get started. So good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all those from joining around the world. A very special welcome to this 27th edition of the CII Partnership Summit and to this conversation with Kevin Rudd. Mr. Rudd is the President and CEO of the Asia Society and a former Prime Minister of Australia. But much more than that, it's a particular pleasure to welcome you, Kevin, to this session as one of our most thoughtful leaders in global and regional foreign policy. You've had vast experience in both implementing and forming policies for economic growth and development. You know, as the Prime Minister of Australia, of course, you led the country out of the global financial crisis. And you're also, I know, seen as one of the architects of the G20. And I think more than anything else, you're a regular participant on CII platforms, especially in the Partnership Summit. And you've continuously guided us and given us such, I think, important and insightful input of how we should plan our own future and the future of Indian industry. I'll make a few introductory comments and then turn it over to you for some introductory comments, and then we will get into a conversation later on. It's also a pleasure to welcome our High Commissioner to Australia, Mr. Manpreet Singh Vora. Thank you for joining this morning. Good morning. I should say good afternoon. I think it would be good afternoon for you in Australia. The last few months have really been quite remarkable in changes in the world around us. We've seen a remarkable economic recovery from the pandemic. I think growth has bounced back faster than any forecast. And it's bounced back in a very uneven way. It's bounced back in a manner which has led to great supply chain stresses in different parts of the world, as in everything from semiconductors to shipping. And at the same time, it's left, I think, some of the most disadvantaged still struggling with the effects of losses in employment in the pandemic. And also the lack of recovery, the relative lack of recovery in high employment creating sectors like travel and tourism, which are still sort of struggling to get back to some degree of normalcy. We've seen, as we were chatting just now, we've seen significant advances on the foreign policy side. The Quad that we were talking about, the group of the United States, Australia, Japan, and India, really seems to have come into its own, both as an arena where countries that are like-minded can meet to talk about issues in the Indo-Pacific as it was originally intended, but also, I think, as a grouping to talk more broadly about issues, for example, responding to the pandemic. And there is, as you all know, a very useful initiative underway to provide vaccines to much of Asia. I think there's a commitment to provide 1 billion vaccines to Southeast Asia in the course of 2022. I'll make three thoughts, though, of areas which I think would be interesting to get into this morning. First, one of the things that's been striking as we've gone through this pandemic has been the relative absence of global leadership. Now, this was a conscious choice of the previous American president, but even after the election of of Joe Biden, it doesn't seem like the US is trying to get back to playing its leadership role in the world that we had come to expect at the time of global crises. And the US still seems somewhat inward oriented, still seems somewhat focused on what's happening within. And given that multilateral institutions get their heft, they get their credibility from powerful countries subscribing to their rules and following those rules, this piece seems to be missing still. And I would love to hear your thoughts on this as we get into the discussion. Second, one of the responses to the pandemic has been a resurgent state. It's been a resurgence of government, with governments the world round playing a much more significant and dominant role in the affairs of countries and people. That response has been necessary, but it also has implications in the long run for everything from tax rates to the weight of the state on individual actions and business, to the impact potentially on long-run competitiveness of firms. And again, would love to hear your thoughts on how you see the world evolving given this potentially stronger role of the state going forward. And then third, we've just last month all been watching what's been happening in Glasgow with COP26. There's a renewed commitment to try to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees. India made some important commitments in Glasgow. The first time that we've made commitments to get to a zero carbon future. And there are several, I think, positive moves, but again, there's a real need for coordination, a real need for a sense that we're all in this together and that we need to do each our own share in getting to our broader sustainability, meeting our broader sustainability objectives. So many broad topics that we can get into. And I think there's really no better person to guide us through these kinds of major issues that we face in the world today than Kevin Rudd. So if I could request you, Kevin, to speak to us with some introductory comments for a few minutes, and then we will get into a discussion. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you for the kind invitation to join you again with the CII in India. Good to see you, High Commissioner, and I hope the Australians are treating you reasonably in your work in Canberra. And more importantly, for all of us, I recently was able to watch the test against England at the Gabba in my hometown of Brisbane. And nothing that delights the heart more of an Australian and an Indian than to smash England in a cricket. So we can all celebrate England's demise. So on the core questions, however, which you pose, which are important questions. America looking in, looking out. Secondly, the return of the state. And thirdly, the future of climate. And frankly, within that, the future of Mother India as well. So let me try and take a minute or two on each of those, and let's open up our conversation. On America looking in, looking out, it is a question of our glass being half full or half empty. I personally had a view that the glass was starting to look fairly empty under President Trump, not simply because of his unique political style, but on the question of its dual impact. One, the fracturing of US domestic politics and causing the emergence and legitimization of a more isolationist America from traditionally the most internationalist of parties in the United States, namely the Republican Party. And that, I think, was a structural danger for all of us who wish to see an activist America in the world. And secondly, the geopolitical and geoeconomic attitude of Trump's nationalist isolationism towards traditional friends, partners, and allies. Look at the threats of tariffs towards India, for example. And at the same time, the legitimization of protectionism in the American body politic in a Republican administration, which is traditionally the champions of free trade. So the fact that Trump is not there, and the fact that there is a more internationalist Democrat administration under Biden, puts the glass from being, as it were, half empty and significantly half empty, a quarter empty in my view, or a quarter full, to one which started to look more like a glass 2/3 full. Of course, the legacy factors which Biden has to now deal with because of the Trump period in office are significant. A divided political system, the legitimization of protectionism, as well as a new Republican questioning of America's role in the world from the far right of the Republican Party. And so Biden's response to the Trumpian challenge, but also to the China challenge, I believe, has been to double down on the rebuilding of American domestic economic strength. And if you look very carefully at the first year of the Biden administration, it has had as its central organizing principle the passage of relevant acts of the United States Congress, not just by way of economic stimulus, but most importantly, investment in the future drivers of American long-term economic growth. The jury is still out about how effective that will be, but the primary emphasis in year one has been, frankly, to begin to rebuild the foundations of American national power. At the same time, as we all know, as friends and partners of the United States, America's second priority has been the rebuilding of its alliances and strategic partnerships around the world. In our part of the world, of course, with Japan, with South Korea, with India, with Southeast Asia, and the fact the intensity of the diplomacy has been quite strong, given the absence of presidential interest, frankly, in this part of the world during the period of the Trump administration. So on those two questions, I think we see a relatively activist US administration. Its Achilles heel has been its indifference on the economy, by which I mean not the domestic economy, but its indifference to the free trade economy around the world. The absence of America from RCEP, the absence of America from the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the absence of America in rebuilding the centrality of the World Trade Organization as the driving force for global trade liberalization, because it is overwhelmingly protectionist American Congress, both Democrat and Republican. So that is the Achilles heel of American strategy. Its politics and its geopolitics, I think, are soundly thought out, but its weaknesses in geoeconomics, in the center of which is trade and this protectionist impulse. On the return of the state, your second thesis, yes, it's true. Partly it's natural and unavoidable, notwithstanding the impact of the neoliberal economic agenda since the rise of Thatcher and Reagan. For the last 40 years, you've seen a general retreat of the state and a general resurgence of the market. The consequence of which is there for all to see, by and large. The growth levels around the world have been, on the whole, strong through the 80s, 90s, and noughties, until, of course, we produced two great global dislocations. First was the global financial crisis. That's when my own hair turned white, because I happened to be in office at the time. Many of my colleagues had their hair fall out. Mine just turned white. In the largest economic downturn since the Great Depression. And then secondly, less than a decade later, the global pandemic, and as a consequence, a further global economic downturn, now the largest since the Depression. And so these have been enormous systemic assaults on the global, shall we say, public goods of global financial and economic management on the one hand, and global public health management on the other. And it is necessary, therefore, for the state to step up, to step in and to intervene in order to hold the economy and to hold, shall we say, public health together. Of course, the critical question mark, given the massive accumulation of global public sector debt as a result of this massive intervention, and coming on the back of a previous massive intervention less than a decade before with the global financial crisis, is the extent to which, through the International Monetary Fund and the G20, we now have sufficient political resolve and policy roadmap to bring us back to a position of what I describe as overall fiscal, financial and economic balance once the engine drivers of recovery set in. The temptation will be to keep the state at the forefront. In fact, there needs, in terms of a vibrant economy in all of our countries, a better balance between market and the state than perhaps we currently have. And if I could make a sidebar comment there, one of China's great dangers at the moment domestically is, in fact, for not only the global pandemic, but also the trade war with the United States, but also the statist and pro-party attitude of Xi Jinping to cause the balance between state and market in China to lurch back much more decisively in the direction of the party state and away from the market and principal private sector actors. And I believe to the long-term detriment of China's overall economic growth performance. And the final question you raised, which is climate, I would simply say this, that the international community welcomes India's participation in Glasgow. I've been on the other side of the trenches fighting Indian bureaucrats and political leaders on climate change since the Copenhagen conference in 2009. So I know the center of gravity in politics in India on this question and the reasons for it. I don't need to be reminded of them. I've had multiple lectures from many government ministers, prime ministers down about all of that. So the script is well known. However, the other script is perhaps less known, that unless we have China and India on a trajectory towards carbon neutrality, then not only will it destroy China's and India's environment and economies by century's end because of unsustainable levels of global warming between 3 and 4 degrees centigrade, but it will also fundamentally undermine the global environmental commons and global economic growth as well. So therefore, it's essential for these two large economies to come within the global consensus on this. I noticed carefully what Prime Minister Modi said about his conditionality for India's carbon neutrality soft pledge of 2070, which was India would need $1 trillion international investment fund to engineer the energy transformation, which is necessary. Now, here's my wild guess, by the way, my wild prediction. Don't be surprised if the international community rises to that challenge, together with the resources of the Indian government itself, because we do not, none of us, wish to get to a stage, say by the 2040s, where through a combination of technology and capital, the Chinese are on track towards carbon neutrality, but India is not. And India, in turn, becomes the world's largest emitter. And under those circumstances in the future, that we didn't have a capacity to engineer the transformation in the Indian energy sector and the broader Indian economy. So I'm, whereas many in India would have said, Prime Minister Modi's promise of carbon neutrality 2070, put $1 trillion on the table, was basically kissing it all goodbye. I actually have a different view. I think India has entered the public policy space. I think the international investment community is frankly awash with cash, looking for somewhere to go. And if we can devise the at-scale renewable energy transformation projects in India, don't be surprised if we actually start to make much more rapid progress on this than some of the cynics would suggest. I'll leave my comments there.
Thank you very much, Kevin. Thank you for, as always, giving us, I think, a perspective that was both insightful, comprehensive, and at the same time very precise. So, thank you. I want to come back to to each of those topics, and if we could delve into them somewhat more deeply. I thought your comment on the US and its that where we've seen substantial progress in filling the glass under President Biden were very insightful and exactly on track. And there is indeed this protectionist impulse, this protectionist almost genie that's been let out now, which seems to be unfortunately cross-party. And how do you see that? Is there any prospect of that correcting going forward? We were having a discussion the other day, and we were talking about India and the US and its participation in free trade arrangements in Asia. India, as you know, dropped out of RCEP. Some of us think it was a mistake. Many think it was done for all the right reasons. There was, of course, this issue of China and China's involvement in RCEP, which was a very big factor in that call. But there's also the prospect of joining CPTPP, which China and Taiwan, and I think the UK have now applied to join. And there's a thought that maybe the US and India should jointly apply to join. Now, domestic politics in both India and in the US, I mean, in India, it's not talked about at all yet, but maybe we need to start getting a dialogue going around it and getting people thinking about what would be involved in joining such a trade pact, because it involves much more than trade, as you well know. And in the US, the Biden administration, I mean, I think in the run-up to the election as well, President Biden said that the US would not join. So, do you see any prospect of this protectionist impulse in the US turning around? Because it's so important for the world to fix what's going on at the WTO, not just ignore it, to try to get trade discussions moving in many areas, and it seems like the US is kind of a holdout at present, relative to most other parts of the world, including India, including China, including many other countries. But the US seems to be the big holdout on a greater trade engagement.
I think I'm one of those rare breeds of people who is a free trading social democrat. That's me. So I'm from the center left. I'm the equivalent, I suppose, of elements of the Congress Party in the Indian political spectrum. But we in the Australian Labor Party went through an intellectual and policy transformation about 20 to 30 years ago. And there was a core reason for it. It was not a fad. We became convinced that free trade was best for poor working families because it generated more jobs and it resulted in cheaper goods for poor and working people, as opposed to subsidized industrial arrangements. A small example, as a child growing up in Australia, the shirt that I'm wearing at the moment, manufactured wholly in Australia, would have probably cost about $15 in about 1970. I could buy a similar shirt today at the shop up the corner here, similar quality, for about $20, $25, and that's in nominal dollar terms today, not in real dollar comparisons. And so if you're a working family where you've got disposable income which is fixed, these are big opportunities to improve your standard of living. So that's where I come from philosophically, and for those reasons. I also believe that when you have, however, in free trade, there will be inevitable industrial restructuring. It doesn't mean you can continue to protect your domestic industries the way in which you did. And as a consequence, you can either throw everyone into the fire, or you can restructure those industries with appropriate adjustment payments to businesses and firms and to workers to retrain them out and into the industries of tomorrow. And that's through appropriate social adjustment payments. If you do it that way, you're less likely to engender the sort of political reaction we've had in the United States, where the old Rust Belt states, the old Steel Belt states, became the Rust Belt states, became the Trump states, and became the protectionist states. So we need to be very mindful of, I think, the political economy of this question, given that the ultimate economic question, I think, is fairly clear that freer trade is better for working people, whatever the country, and so long as it's attached to a strategy of structural adjustment where government has a supporting role. In the United States, what will turn this around? I think one thing can turn it around, and that is the unfolding risk of inflation. The unfolding risk of inflation, which is in part induced by the supply chain crisis, in part induced by the trade wars between China and the United States well before the pandemic hit, then turbocharged by the pandemic, and then legitimized by protectionism being good. Look at the idiots in the United Kingdom who ran the Brexit argument, and look at the comparable idiots in the United States who ran the America First argument, none of whom could ever answer honestly to working people how their material circumstances were going to improve as a result of all of this. So now working families in America are facing inflationary challenges for the first time in 30 years in terms of the cost of basic goods and services. Now, in part, that's a direct product of protectionism. And in part, the only way it can be dealt with is to reduce protectionism. Hence why there's now an emerging debate in the United States about the wisdom of sustaining the current mega tariffs imposed on the Chinese by the Americans at the beginning of the trade war. So this could be the foundational, as it were, elements of a turn to a more liberal trade agenda if it had to be driven out of Walmart rather than out of Washington, in my own judgment. Finally, in terms of the mega politics of it, you speculated before about the possibility of a combined Indian-American application to TPP. Look, I understand the difficult politics of all of that in both capitals. But you know something? Here we have a Marxist-Leninist state, the Chinese, which has outflanked both of you by going from high levels of protectionism and industrial support to now presenting an application to the 11 TPP states, including Australia, for membership, and not seeking an amendment to the original terms of agreement. Yeah. So the ability of the Chinese Marxist-Leninist system to, as it were, turn rapidly, tactically and politically in this direction, I think is formidable. And then it becomes a question of enormous pressure on countries like Australia, Japan and the ROK, or should I say the TPP member states, including Vietnam, as to whether they would accept such a thing. So my appeal to our friends in Delhi, as it is to our friends in Washington, is don't let short-term economic adjustment stand in the way of long-term strategic economic advantage, which comes from being a member of this enormous economic and trading and investment entity called the Indo-Pacific region of the 21st century. And for India, if I could be gratuitous and offer some unsolicited advice to all my friends in the Indian cabinet, I have quite a number, is look, I really do get the politics. I'm a politician, right? I get it. But you know something? Graduating it up from step 1, join APEC. Step 2, join RCEP. Step 3, start your conditional negotiations with the TPP states. Do so with the Americans, because if you sold to the Indian body politic a proposition which said India has now got full access to the American domestic market, and of course the Americans then look to India as this huge new growth market, as opposed to being permanently under the spell that it's either China or bust in terms of its own future economic opportunities. So I do think, to paraphrase a term from the Chinese, it could be win-win for America and India.
Thank you, Kevin. I think that's a very powerful argument, and one that we must try to give as much visibility to in India. Thank you. I thought the comment that you made about that was the shift that took place in Australia, that free trade is good for working people, and that this was a shift that took place within the Labour Party. But that must have depended on people like you in the party to help make that shift. And the same thing happened in India, with the shift to free trade is good for the average Indian, was a shift that took place within the Congress party with Narasimha Rao and Manmohan Singh. It was the same shift that took place in New Zealand, I guess, with David Lange and the Labour Party again. So in a sense, maybe we should look to President Biden making that same shift happen, or a successor in the Democratic Party as opposed to the Republican Party, that let the shift happen. The challenge, I suppose, is that the Republican Party seems to have, like the Conservatives in Britain, seem to have become the party that appeals to the working class in a sense, at least a certain element there. It's
saying
if
recently,
you have any thoughts on how that would be managed in a way?
Well, in the domestic political economy of this, it is always difficult. But most of the things that are worthwhile doing in politics and economics are always difficult. Yeah. And they remain difficult for a few years. And then everyone says, well, why didn't we do it much earlier? And then it becomes one of these self-evident truths until you have some demagogue walk in either from the far left or the far right and saying, a pox on all your houses. And I find it difficult to forgive, for example, Boris Johnson's populist right-wing nationalism and an effective coalition with Nigel Farage from UKIP to trumpet the mirage, the illusion that somehow a protectionist Britain, freed from Europe, would somehow be a stronger Britain for working families. Instead, it's a political script based around crude impulses of nationalism and ethno-nationalism and English nationalism, dressed up as some sort of economic philosophy. It's not, it's just populist politics and ethno-nationalism. And the problem with populist politics and ethno-nationalism is that for working people, ultimately, it does not work. They end up with less jobs and higher prices. And that is not good for working people. So at the end of the day, you need the Raos or the Manmohan Singhs of this world to say there is a different pathway forward. And we intend to navigate that. I think it's equally possible for both Congress and frankly for the BJP in India to begin to construct the politics of this around a bold vision for India's economic future, one which would rival China. 20 years ago, when we had the debates about China and India, these were seen as alternative nouns within the same phrase about rising Asia. And we know what's happened in the last 20 years. That need not be the case for the next 20. It really need not, because in China now, we have the return of the state and the return of its own protectionist impulses through a Chinese national strategy of 自力更生, national self-reliance under Xi Jinping. There is therefore a strategic opportunity for India now as China turns left on its economics, turns towards the party state, for India now to discover the market and to embrace it. It's a difficult political economy process, and I know in the business of active day-to-day, hand-to-hand political combat, it's quite hard. I understand that. But my experience of voting people in all of our robust democracies is that the voters are not stupid. The voters actually understand if the argument is put clearly to them about how the cake can be grown with bigger slices for everybody, even if they are unequal slices, as opposed to a smaller cake with perhaps more equal slices of a smaller cake. And I think that's the essential dilemma we face. Hard, but doable.
Thank you. I wrote an article, well, part one of an article called A Window of Opportunity last week, and part two is this week, making the argument that some of China's struggles are opening a window of opportunity for India, and India must take it. You're helping me greatly with part two of the article. So.
We should say to all those watching this webcast that we have not consulted, as with
we haven't. We haven't.
As with most things, we just happen to have arrived at the same solution to a common analytical problem.
So I wanted to pursue that your comments on the return of the state in China, because it does seem like China's had this incredible run for 40 years. In 1980, China and India were both the same per capita GDP, the same GDP overall. Today, China is 5 times India's GDP, 5 times India's per capita GDP. China's manufacturing sector today is 8 times India's. China's R&D spending today is 20 times India's. I mean, these are, dramatic differences that are a reflection of China's tremendous success at a time when India has also been doing better. So it's a huge gap, but I think there's still this opportunity. And it seems, I don't know if it seems like China's stumbling today, that there's a certain degree of questioning of the role of business. There's an attack on large business, an attack on the tech giants. There are, it seems like there are, this whole zero COVID policy of China's, where one wonders how they're going to get out of it. And there seems to be strong commitments that have been made publicly, which would make it difficult for the leadership in China to walk away now from a zero COVID policy. So, do you see, if you had to make a forecast for China over the next 20 years, do you see a much less positive future?
I think on balance, Xi Jinping's current political economy settings will slow China's growth rate more than would naturally occur. And there are several reasons for it. One is the aggregate position of his determination to preserve the power of the party. And so as a consequence, at a level of macroeconomic policy settings, the party increasingly has supplanted even the technocratic class within the state apparatus in the setting of China's overall policy course on the economy. If we cast our mind back to Jiang Zemin and Zhu Rongji, the division of labor between what the party did on politics and what the state did on the economy was relatively clear. And Zhu Rongji was given, I won't say carte blanche, but near carte blanche to begin to reform the state and enterprise sector and to engineer another raft of basic reforms around set prices in the economy, effectively to destroy all price fixing and price setting in the economy by the planning apparatus, and to decrease the overall sector of GDP being driven out of the SOE sector. That's no longer the case. The party is back with a vengeance. It's important for our Indian audience to understand there's a double whammy here. The party is back against the state, and the party state is back against the private sector. So, and on the private sector, the argument is about private sector monopoly. Mind you, there's no parallel argument deployed by the Chinese about their continued state sector monopolies. So that is, in my judgment, an argument of convenience. The real concern on the part of China's party state is about the power of the Chinese private sector. As 60% of GDP, the bulk of taxation revenue, the bulk of innovation, the bulk of new employment generation, etc. And as a consequence, the corporate leaders of the Chinese private sector becoming alternative authority figures within the country. That's the ultimate politics driving this. Then there's a second set of shifts to what I describe as the left in Chinese economic policy, which is around the question of income distribution and the Chinese common prosperity agenda of the last 12 months, and thinly veiled statements to the private sector that the historical levels of income inequality are no longer sustainable within a Marxist state. That also is having a palpable effect. A third shift to the left has been what Xi Jinping calls the mixed economy model. That's code language for if you're a successful private firm, an SOE could well take equity in your firm. And if you're a failing public sector firm, then a successful private sector firm may be directed to take equity in that public sector firm. Finally, we now have the role of party secretaries and party committees within private firms and their management structures. You put all that together and you're a CEO of a middle cap Chinese firm in Hangzhou. Suddenly you've got a whole bunch of stuff you have to deal with to manage the politics of being in business than you ever had to deal with before. Now, if you're an average Mr. Wang running such an enterprise in Hangzhou, market cap, say, of $1 billion US, not a mega firm, but a big firm, and you've got several hundred staff, maybe several thousand staff, then you begin to ask yourself the question, am I going to continue to invest in my company's future? Or am I going to put the money under a mattress? Or am I going to try to get my money out of the country and do other things with it? And so the animal spirits, as Maynard Keynes reminds us, are an interesting beast to observe. And so when you disturb the animal spirits so fundamentally as Xi Jinping has disturbed them, I begin to question, therefore, as to where China's growth rate will actually land. And if the Chinese state's efforts to sustain, say, a growth rate of 5 can only be achieved with continuing large levels of fiscal stimulus or monetary policy stimulus or China's own form of quantitative easing, then as we know, that can generate financial crises over time because of high levels of indebtedness, particularly from state-owned banks. And state-owned banks supporting SOEs sustaining growth levels which are not sustainable by normal market conditions. So for those reasons, my argument to our friends in India was be careful in your analysis, look carefully at what's unfolding in China, and if India is to be given a second big chance at this, that time is now. I'm not sure it will repeat itself, but I think the opportunity is there for India to look beyond the retail politics of the next 12 months, which are always hard in any country, and look to the medium-term economic yield and then the long-term political benefit.
Thank you. I think that's very, very wise advice. Thank you. And I just as I think we're just about out of time, but I have to ask you one follow-on last question, which is, can you take further what you would like to see? What do you think India should do to really take advantage of this opportunity. Given that, and I think your message on APEC, RCEP, CPTPP as a sequence from an international trade perspective and an international orientation is very powerful. What should we do at home? What should we do economically? Please be gratuitous in your advice.
Yeah, I try not to be, because I have many friends in India. It's not an easy country to govern. I know the history, and I have great respect for the intelligence and sophistication of the Indian civil service. But here would be my simple suggestion. The CII, this Confederation of Indian Industry, I would go and see Mr. Modi, and I would go and see the Commerce Minister, and simply with the simple proposition, the time has come to join APEC. Let's stop fooling around with this. Let's just do it. Remember, APEC does not require India to do anything. It is a free association of open economies where you have large rolling technical discussions about trade facilitation and about free trading arrangements if you politically choose to go in that direction. In other words, it empowers the civil service to think differently about its role in, as it were, the macro management of the economy rather than the micro control of the economy. And most of these economies in the APEC community have been along the same journey in one form or another. So no one's going to be terribly superior about it, because we've all been there and been through it, and it's always hard. But my advice in terms of starting there is the Commerce Minister and the Prime Minister in your system would be enormously advantaged by a combined position from CII saying, this is the first step forward. Secondly, it costs you nothing in terms of an immediate set of policy actions. Thirdly, it sends a powerful signal to every other economy in Asia that India is coming back. And then the other steps should be taken one by one.
Kevin, thank you very much for your comments, for this discussion this morning. Thank you for your insight on the US, on China, on what that means as a mirror for us to look at in India, to see what we should be doing in our own interest and what's in our own long-term interests. And I think I can't phrase it as brilliantly as you did, but something along the lines that you said of, don't let our short-term economic priorities deter us from our long-term objectives and path. And I think that wise advice is something we should all take to heart. So thank you again for being with us this morning. Thank you, as always, for the input that you've provided and for being such a great guide to understanding the world around us. Thank you.
Happy to be with you, and my best to all of our friends in Delhi and across India.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Bye now.